Welcome to Kunzy Podcast English. Today, we will dive into one of the most talked about global topics, US-China clash. The war begins. Stay tuned to explore the deep insights into the conflict between these two superpowers and its impact on the global economy. Part 1. Introduction. Imagine a fierce battle, but not one fought with guns, bombs, or missiles. Instead, it's a battle of wits between the two most powerful nations on Earth, the U.S. and China. This is a trade war, an intense standoff where the weapons are not bombs or bullets, but policies, economic strategies, and most importantly, tariffs. These battles are not fought on physical battlefields, but on the global trade map. In this context, tariffs, a financial tool, become the main weapon. So what exactly are tariffs? Simply put, tariffs are taxes that governments impose on imported goods from other countries. This means that when China exports products to the U.S., or vice versa, each government decides whether to impose taxes on those goods. The main purpose of these tariffs is to raise the price of imported goods, giving an advantage to domestically produced goods and forcing businesses and consumers to reconsider their choices in favor of local products. The U.S. and China have started imposing tariffs on each other's goods in an effort to protect their own economic interests and strengthen their national positions on the global stage. This situation has led to an all-out trade war that has lasted for years, severely impacting the economies of both countries. This is not a typical dispute. It's a battle not just over economics but also over global power and influence. Though no weapons of mass destruction are involved, the consequences of this war are just as significant. Millions of jobs, the prices of goods, global supply chains, and even the future of entire industries have been affected by the decisions made by the leaders of these nations. But why did these two countries choose the path of tariffs instead of military force? And could this be the final victory for one side, or simply the beginning of a long-lasting conflict with unpredictable consequences? These are the questions we will explore on this journey. Let's dive into the complexity and depth of the U.S.-China trade war to better understand the strategies at play and the far-reaching impacts this conflict has on the world. Part 2. What are tariffs? A tariff is a tax imposed by a country on imported goods from other countries. When goods are brought into a country, the government of that country may apply a tariff to the product, making the price of imported goods higher. The purpose of tariffs is to regulate international trade, protect domestic production, and sometimes act as a tool to exert pressure in trade disputes. However, the effects of tariffs are not just about raising prices. They can have deep and wide-reaching impacts on the economy, employment, and international relations. The reasons why countries apply tariffs are diverse, but the main three are to protect domestic industries, generate government revenue, and act as a strategic tool in international conflicts. First, tariffs are used to protect domestic industries. One of the reasons countries impose tariffs is to make imported products more expensive compared to domestically produced goods. When imports are heavily taxed, consumers are more likely to buy locally produced goods, helping protect and develop the domestic industry. This is particularly important for emerging industries, or those facing fierce competition from cheap products from other countries. For example, if a country imposes high tariffs on imported cars, consumers will tend to buy domestically produced cars, helping safeguard domestic car manufacturers. Second, tariffs play a significant role as a revenue source for governments. The revenue generated from tariffs helps governments fund public services and can also be used to reduce national debt. For countries experiencing budget deficits, tariffs provide a direct and easy way to increase revenue without having to raise taxes on citizens. However, a tariff system that is too high can lead to problems, such as increased prices for goods and reduced purchasing power for consumers. Third, tariffs can serve as a tool in negotiations and international conflicts. In trade disputes between countries, tariffs become a method of exerting pressure. Countries may impose tariffs on the goods of their trading partners to force them to change policies or meet certain commitments, such as opening up markets, protecting domestic companies' interests, or adhering to environmental or labor standards. Sometimes, countries also use tariffs to respond to unfair trade practices or protective policies implemented by other nations. As for how tariffs are calculated, there are two main methods. The first method is to calculate the tariff based on a percentage of the value of the goods. This is the most common method and is often used in international trade negotiations. For example, if a country applies a 10% tariff and the imported goods are worth $1,000, the consumer will have to pay an additional $100 in tariffs. This method is straightforward and easy to understand, but it can lead to significant price fluctuations as the value of goods changes. The second method is to calculate the tariff with a fixed fee per item, regardless of its value. For example, a country may impose a $50 tariff on each imported smartphone, whether the phone is worth $100 or $1,000. This method simplifies the tariff calculation and is easy to apply to items with very different values. However, fixed tariffs can lead to unfairness, as lower value items may end up bearing a higher tariff than higher value items. Whether applying tariffs as a percentage of value or a fixed fee per item, the ultimate goal is to control the flow of goods internationally and influence the domestic economy. However, tariff decisions are not always straightforward, as they can have unintended consequences, such as increasing costs for consumers, reducing the competitiveness of domestic businesses, or even sparking trade wars between countries. In conclusion, tariffs are not just a fee imposed by the government on imported goods. Behind them lies a complex strategy used to protect domestic industries, generate revenue for the government, and act as a tool in international conflicts. Understanding tariffs and their impact helps us realize the importance of this issue in global trade disputes. Part 3. Why did Trump impose tariffs? During his presidency, Donald Trump made the bold decision to impose tariffs on Chinese goods. The reasoning behind this controversial move was multifaceted, stemming from economic concerns, national security issues, and strategic trade goals. Understanding why these tariffs were implemented sheds light on the underlying forces driving the U.S.-China trade war. The first and most prominent reason was the trade imbalance between the U.S. and China. For years, the U.S. had been importing far more from China than it was exporting. This trade deficit raised alarms in Washington, as many felt that the U.S. was losing out on economic opportunities. By imposing tariffs, Trump aimed to correct this imbalance, making Chinese goods more expensive and encouraging U.S. consumers and businesses to turn to domestic products or goods from other countries. In theory, this would reduce the trade deficit and encourage more American production and consumption of U.S.-made goods. Another significant concern was the unfair trade practices and intellectual property violations allegedly committed by China. The U.S. government accused China of engaging in practices that were seen as unfair to American businesses, such as stealing intellectual property, forcing companies to transfer technology as a condition of doing business in China, and subsidizing Chinese industries at the expense of global competition. These actions were seen as harmful to American innovation and businesses. By imposing tariffs, Trump hoped to force China to change these practices and protect the interests of U.S. companies. In addition, American businesses often faced considerable challenges when trying to operate in China. Many found themselves at a disadvantage due to Chinese regulatory barriers, unfair competition, and a lack of equal access to Chinese markets. American companies were frustrated with the restrictions placed on them, while Chinese companies were able to freely enter and dominate the U.S. market. By imposing tariffs, Trump sought to level the playing field, allowing U.S. businesses to compete more fairly on the global stage. Moreover, Trump sought to bring manufacturing and jobs back to the U.S. Over the years, many American manufacturers had outsourced their production to China due to cheaper labor and production costs. However, this trend resulted in a loss of U.S. jobs and a shrinking industrial base. The tariffs were part of Trump's broader strategy to encourage companies to move their production back to the U.S., thus creating more American jobs and reviving the manufacturing sector. Finally, tariffs were also used as a negotiating tool to pressure China into making changes to its trade practices. Trump saw the tariffs as leverage in trade talks, a way to force China to the negotiating table. The idea was simple. If China wanted to reduce the tariffs and avoid further economic strain, it would have to make concessions in key areas like intellectual property protection, market access, and industrial policy. This strategy aimed to force China to adhere to fairer trade practices and secure better terms for American businesses. In conclusion, the tariffs imposed on China by Trump were not just a tactic to raise revenue, but a strategic move aimed at addressing deep-seated trade imbalances, unfair practices, and economic policies that many felt were detrimental to American interests. Whether or not this strategy ultimately proved successful is still up for debate, but it certainly reshaped the economic relationship between the two global superpowers. Part 4. How did China respond? When the U.S. decided to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, Beijing did not hesitate to respond strongly. The Chinese government retaliated by imposing tariffs on American imports, particularly targeting major agricultural products such as soybeans, pork, wine, and other agricultural items. These goods not only hold significant economic value, but are also key exports from the U.S. to China. The imposition of tariffs on these products created substantial pressure on the U.S. economy, especially on farmers and producers, who heavily rely on the Chinese market. China didn't stop at tariffs. It also voiced strong criticism of U.S. policies. Chinese leaders, from top officials to government spokespersons, vehemently rejected the U.S. decisions. They asserted that China would not be subdued by any external pressures and argued that the U.S. measures were unfair in terms of international trade. According to China, these policies were not only coercive but also violated the principles of the World Trade Organization, WTO, undermining global free trade. However, despite the criticism and retaliatory actions, China also displayed a flexible attitude toward negotiations. The Chinese government declared its willingness to engage in direct talks with the U.S. to resolve the ongoing disputes. Nonetheless, China emphasized that any negotiations must safeguard its national interests. While China repeatedly stated that it would not bow to U.S. policies, it also did not wish for tensions to escalate further. The country aimed to maintain economic stability and sustainable development, which could only be achieved through peaceful resolution of the conflict, based on mutual respect and shared benefits. China's flexibility in negotiations shows that it still seeks a close cooperative relationship with the U.S., but not at any cost. China will protect its national interests and will not accept any agreements that could harm the long-term development of the country. The situation becomes even more complicated as both sides realize that this trade war not only affects the two countries, but could also have severe consequences for the global economy. Part 5. How tariffs have changed trade. When tariffs are applied, the first thing people notice is that the price of imported goods rises. Every time a government imposes a tariff on goods, the value of those products increases because exporting companies must pay additional costs to bring their products into another country's market. This means that imported goods become more expensive for consumers and businesses, leading to a decrease in trade between the two countries. As the price of goods rises, consumers tend to reduce their consumption, and businesses face higher production costs, resulting in lower demand for imports. For example, in the trade war between the U.S. and China, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, items like mobile phones, computers, and other electronics became more expensive in the U.S. American consumers had to pay more for these products, and in some cases they would choose alternatives, leading to a reduction in demand for Chinese goods. On the other hand, Chinese businesses also found it difficult to access the U.S. market because of the higher tariffs, making it harder for them to export to the U.S. Businesses in both countries had to adjust their production strategies and supply chains to cope with the tariff situation. One thing companies often do is look for sources of goods from other countries, not just China, to avoid high tariffs. For example, American manufacturers may move part or all of their supply chains to countries like Vietnam, India, or Mexico, where production costs are lower, and they don't face high tariffs. Similarly, Chinese companies may seek to import raw materials from other countries to minimize the impact of U.S. tariffs. The impact of tariffs doesn't just affect the U.S. and China. It also spreads to many other countries, creating an ongoing ripple effect in the global supply chain. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, which are important suppliers of raw materials for products made in China, are also affected. When China seeks alternative sources, or when Chinese companies shift to new markets, countries like Brazil and Argentina may lose a significant portion of their revenue from exports to China. This impact is not limited to the manufacturing countries, but extends to the entire global supply chain. Raw material suppliers, component manufacturers, and logistics companies will all face major changes in the way trade functions. Disruptions in the global supply chain can cause production delays, increase costs, and reduce productivity. Ultimately, it is the consumers and small businesses that will bear the brunt of these changes. So tariffs are not just a political tool between two countries, but also a decisive factor in global trade strategies, causing significant shifts in how the global economy operates. Each change has far-reaching consequences not only for the directly affected countries, but also for other nations and markets worldwide. Part 6. Impact on people and employment. The trade war between the U.S. and China is not just a conflict between governments. It has far-reaching consequences for the daily lives of millions of people and businesses in both countries. While numbers and policies may seem abstract, the real consequences are felt in the everyday lives of people. First, as tariffs were imposed, the prices of imported goods from China to the U.S. soared dramatically. Electronics, clothing, toys, and many consumer products became not only more expensive but also less available. American consumers, who had become accustomed to inexpensive goods from China, now faced higher costs. Products like phones, computers, clothing, and household items no longer just hurt the wallets of consumers, they affected their quality of life. Families in the U.S. now had to pay more for things they once considered ordinary, which reduced purchasing power and indirectly impacted the overall economy. However, the impact is not limited to consumers. Businesses have also been struggling with significant challenges. Tariffs increased the cost of raw materials in production, making manufacturing in the U.S. more expensive. Companies in many sectors, from manufacturing to technology, faced shrinking profits while losing their competitive edge in the international market. These rising costs sometimes force companies to cut other expenses, leading to layoffs or reduced work hours, which created a vicious cycle, making it difficult for the U.S. economy to grow stably. At the same time, some American companies, which had been accustomed to the dominance of cheap goods from China, began to see opportunities arising from this trade war. They hoped to capitalize on reduced competition from Chinese goods and take over the domestic market. Some businesses began to explore new opportunities for production in other countries to avoid high tariffs and reduce dependence on China. However, this transition was not straightforward. Countries like Mexico, Vietnam, and India, although able to provide some alternative options, were not always able to easily replace China in terms of supply chains, and businesses had to face significant challenges in terms of time and cost. Not only was the U.S. affected, but China also had to confront equally serious consequences. As Chinese goods faced higher tariffs in the U.S., Chinese companies could no longer sell their products at the same price, leading to a significant drop in revenue. Key industries in China, including manufacturing, production, and export, began to feel the effects of the tariffs. At the same time, Chinese farmers, who were heavily reliant on exports to the U.S., suffered tremendous losses. Products like soybeans, pork, and fruits experienced a reduction in demand, causing their incomes to decline, and the agricultural sector faced a crisis, particularly in manufacturing, where many Chinese companies relied on exports to sustain operations. The impact of tariffs became increasingly apparent. Thousands of workers in these industries faced the risk of losing their jobs or accepting reduced wages. These workers not only faced the broader changes in the macroeconomy, but also had to struggle with finding alternative jobs in an increasingly difficult labor market. In reality, both the U.S. and China were experiencing job losses across various sectors. Those working in agriculture, manufacturing, and export were the hardest hit. They were not only impacted directly by tariffs, but also by changes in global supply chains. These workers found themselves affected by political decisions, even though they were merely trying to make a living and provide a stable life for their families. In addition to the hardships felt by consumers and businesses, the broader labor market in both countries was severely affected. Workers in industries like agriculture and manufacturing were particularly vulnerable to the fallout from the tariffs. The losses in jobs and wages had far-reaching consequences that rippled throughout the economy. While tariffs have created opportunities for some businesses and industries in both countries, for consumers and workers, particularly in sensitive sectors like manufacturing and agriculture, the impact of this trade war has been clear. Individuals and families have had to endure unwanted changes, and uncertainty has continued to grow in both the U.S. and Chinese economies. Clearly, as this trade war continues, it will have lasting effects not just on politicians and policymakers, but on the lives of millions of workers and consumers. What we do to cope with these effects will determine the future of the global economy. Will we find new ways to overcome these challenges? Or will this merely be part of a long-standing struggle between global powers? Time will answer this question. Part 7. Negotiations and changes over time. The trade conflict between the U.S. and China has seen multiple rounds of negotiations, but reaching a long-term, sustainable agreement has always been an enormous challenge. Despite both countries recognizing that escalating tensions could cause significant damage to the global economy, deep differences in interests and viewpoints have made consensus difficult to achieve. Negotiations have often been interrupted, as each side strives to protect its core interests. The U.S. and China not only have trade differences, but also profound disagreements on political and social issues. One side seeks to alter global trade laws, while the other is intent on maintaining strategic economic benefits. Thus, negotiations are not merely about tariffs or currency exchange rates. They are a struggle for global supremacy, with demands that extend well beyond economic considerations. Tensions have continued to escalate, as both sides persist in maintaining, or even increasing tariffs on each other's goods. In practice, despite efforts to ease the pressure through dialogue, reaching a meaningful agreement has become increasingly difficult. Each country has distinct conditions and priorities, making it hard to find common ground. Under President Joe Biden's leadership, although some policy changes have been made, several tariffs imposed by the Trump administration remain in place. This shows a continuity in the hardline stance toward China, even with a change in U.S. leadership. While some adjustments have been made, Overall, tariffs remain a strategic tool in U.S.-China relations. Beyond just the U.S. and China, this trade war has also impacted other countries. Many nations, particularly those that are key trade partners of both the U.S. and China, have seen an opportunity to adjust their positions. Countries such as the European Union, Japan, and emerging economies have begun negotiations with the U.S. to secure advantageous deals for themselves. They understand that changes in relations between these two global powers will directly affect their own economies, so they must safeguard their interests in this conflict. Despite the ongoing efforts at reconciliation and dialogue, the ultimate goal of the U.S. in this trade war remains unclear. Does the U.S. genuinely want to bring manufacturing jobs back to its shores and restore its industrial base? Does it aim to reshape global trade rules to make them fairer for American businesses? Or is this just a demonstration of American strength and dominance in the global arena? These questions remain unanswered. This ambiguity has created an atmosphere of uncertainty, forcing nations and businesses worldwide to face significant challenges. As the negotiations continue, the hope for a comprehensive agreement remains fragile. Sometimes, it seems a deal is within reach, only for new tensions to arise and derail the process. This ebb and flow makes the U.S.-China story highly dramatic, strategic, and impactful not just for the two countries involved, but for the global economy at large. The future of these negotiations remains unpredictable. Will they lead to a major turning point in international relations, or will they only prolong the divisions and fractures between nations? This is undoubtedly a question that the entire world is watching closely. Part 8. What happens next? The future of U.S.-China trade relations remains uncertain and depends on many unpredictable factors. While both sides have taken small steps towards reducing tensions, such as recent negotiations, the situation is still very challenging. Several possible scenarios could unfold in the future: de-escalation and new agreements. One scenario is that the U.S. and China will eventually find a way to ease trade tensions through new agreements. However, this will require significant changes in both governments, with a willingness to make concessions and address long-standing conflicts. Such an agreement may involve tariff reductions, but it could also demand commitments to change trade structures and reforms in sensitive areas like intellectual property, escalating tensions and continuing trade war. If the situation does not change, the U.S. and China may continue to maintain or even increase tariffs. This would create an unstable business environment, making it difficult for companies to plan long-term. The uncertainty would affect global supply chains and raise prices, directly impacting consumers. An economic Cold War. A more concerning scenario is the emergence of an economic Cold War, where the U.S. and China not only clash over trade, but also become increasingly separate in areas like technology, investment, and other crucial sectors. In this case, other countries will have to choose sides, leading to a world clearly divided into spheres of influence. Regardless of which scenario plays out, one thing is certain: the U.S.-China trade war has left significant lessons for countries and global businesses. It is a lesson about the power of tariffs as a political tool, the interdependence of the global economy, and how major nations use trade as a means to protect national interests. This conflict also highlights that changes in one area, like trade, can have far-reaching effects on other industries and people's daily lives. Whatever the final outcome, the key lesson from the U.S.-China trade war is that nations need to be better prepared to manage risks and maintain flexible trade strategies that can adapt to rapid global changes. Ultimately, the most important lesson may be the need to uphold strong international cooperation strategies, helping countries find solutions to minimize conflict and build a more sustainable global economy. Thank you for watching Kunzy Podcast English today. If you found this content interesting and helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on upcoming exciting videos. Let's share this knowledge and spread these fascinating stories to more people. Wishing you a fun and effective English learning journey. See you in the next podcast episode.